Kofi had never been a girl to make waves. She was quiet, brilliant, and driven. Her mind was always hungry for knowledge, and her thirst for learning never seemed to be quenched. But as she walked home that afternoon, tears stinging her eyes, she couldn't help but feel the crushing weight of a world that seemed to be turning against her. Today had been no different. Another day of humiliation. Another day of feeling like she was invisible in the eyes of those who mattered most. The schoolyard felt colder as Kofi walked past it, her uniform dirty and torn in places. The bright yellow blouse, once crisp and clean, now hung limp and stained with the marks of her punishment. The slap of her teacher's hand still burned on her arms, and she clutched her books tighter, hoping to hold back the flood of tears that threatened to fall. When she reached the door of their modest home, she hesitated. Her chest tightened as she thought of her mother, Imani. Imani was a woman of grace and strength, someone who never seemed fazed by anything. But today, Kofi wasn't sure she could handle another dismissal. She wasn't sure how much longer she could take it. It felt like no one understood her, not even the one person who should have. "Mommy," Kofi called out, her voice barely above a whisper as she stepped inside the small, cozy living room. The room was dim, the curtains drawn, and Imani sat there, engrossed in an old book. She didn't look up at Kofi's entrance, not at first. She always did this, immersing herself in her books as though they were the only thing that mattered. Kofi had always understood it, and yet today it made her feel more alone than ever before. "What is it, Kofi?" Imani asked, her voice laced with irritation but also curiosity. She marked her page in the book and raised her eyes to meet her daughter, though they were distant, almost unfocused. To Imani, Kofi's complaints had always seemed like the drama of a child. She had learned to brush them off. Kofi dropped her school bag on the floor and slowly sank to her knees, the weight of the day dragging her down. Her eyes, puffy and red from crying, looked up at her mother, silently pleading for understanding. But Imani's expression remained unchanged. "Mommy, Mrs. Adebio punished me again today," Kofi began, her voice trembling. "She hit me in front of the whole class. She made me kneel outside for hours just because I answered a question Grace couldn't. I didn't do anything wrong." Imani frowned, but her concern was fleeting. She closed her book with a soft snap and set it aside before speaking. "Kofi, how many times do I have to tell you to stop making a fuss? If Mrs. Adebio punished you, then maybe you did something wrong." Kofi's heart dropped into her stomach. She could already feel the weight of her mother's words, the dismissal, the lack of empathy. Her voice cracked as she continued. "I didn't do anything wrong, Mommy. Mrs. Adebio doesn't like me because I'm always the top of the class and Grace is. She calls me names and the other kids laugh at me. It's not fair." Imani's face remained impassive. "Life isn't fair, Kofi," she said. "You can't expect everyone to like you, just focus on your studies and stop provoking your teacher. There's no point in complaining. I don't want to hear it again." Kofi's world seemed to collapse. She had hoped for a moment of compassion, but once again her mother's words were like walls closing in around her. "Okay, Mommy," Kofi said quietly, trying to hold back the sobs that threatened to burst forth. She stood and walked out of the room, her shoulders slumped in defeat. She made her way to her bedroom, dragging her feet as though the very floor beneath her was weighted with grief. Inside her room, she threw herself onto her bed, clutching her math textbook to her chest, but it was impossible to focus. The cruel laughter of her classmates echoed in her ears, the sting of Mrs. Adebio's cane still burned on her arms. Why didn't anyone believe her? Why did it feel like the world was against her? Her thoughts spiraled and she buried her face in her pillow, trying to muffle the sound of her quiet sobs. Unbeknownst to Kofi, her mother Imani was packing in the living room, her thoughts a whirlwind. She had seemed indifferent on the outside, but something about Kofi's plea had lingered in her mind. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, something she couldn't quite place. But she pushed the thought aside. Imani had always known how to keep her distance, how to hide her own emotions, and for years she had built a life around keeping secrets, secrets she couldn't afford to reveal. Not yet anyway. The next morning, Kofi dragged herself out of bed, her eyes still heavy with the weight of yesterday's events. The sun was barely up, casting a soft glow over the room, but Kofi felt nothing but dread. She had grown used to the tension between her and Mrs. Adebio. The way the teacher always found reasons to humiliate her, to belittle her intelligence, to make her feel small. She could feel it even now, the oppressive presence of the teacher looming in her thoughts. When she reached the school gates, Kofi hesitated. The sound of the bell ringing in the distance seemed deafening, urging her to step forward. She walked through the gates and into the yard, but everything felt like a blur. The laughter of her classmates was distant, the world around her fading into the background. She wasn't even sure why she continued to go to school, why she kept trying to be the best when it only brought her pain. As she entered the classroom, she could feel Mrs. Adebio's gaze on her before she even saw the teacher. The woman's sharp eyes seemed to pierce through her, and Kofi felt her heart beat faster in her chest. Mrs. Adebio sat at her desk, her arms crossed, a scowl on her face. And beside her sat Grace, always the teacher's pet, always the one who could do no wrong. Late again, Kofi? Mrs. Adebio's voice was cold, cutting through the air. Go to the back of the class and kneel, you're not deserving of a desk today. Kofi's face flushed with embarrassment as she slowly made her way to the back of the room. She could feel the eyes of her classmates on her, the whispers, the snickers. It had become a daily routine, one she couldn't escape. Her knees hit the cold floor and she tried to steady her breathing, but it was hard to block out the burning shame, the humiliation. She knelt there, her arms shaking as she clenched her fists, willing herself not to cry. As the lesson continued, Kofi's mind wandered, her thoughts growing darker. The world felt heavy around her. Why did Mrs. Adebio hate her so much? What had she done to deserve this kind of treatment? And why did her mother, the one person she trusted most, refuse to believe her? Her mind raced with questions, and yet all she could do was remain silent, a prisoner in her own thoughts. The bell finally rang, signaling the end of the day, but Kofi didn't feel any relief. She had learned to dread the walk home, the silence that hung between her and her mother. It was the same every day, Imani's indifference, her refusal to listen, her inability to understand what Kofi was going through. But today something felt different. Something was about to change, though Kofi had no idea just how deep the currents of her life ran, or the truths her mother had been hiding for so long. When Kofi arrived home, she didn't even wait for her mother's usual questions. She simply went to her room and closed the door behind her, hoping to find some peace. But the peace never came. The storm inside her heart raged on. Imani, on the other hand, sat quietly in the living room, staring at the wall, deep in thought. She knew that something had to change. She could feel the pull of destiny whispering in the air, and it was only a matter of time before the truth came crashing down. The questions were mounting, and so were the answers Imani wasn't sure she was ready to face. The days following Kofi's ordeal in class were a blur, each one blending into the next with a feeling of inevitability. The sharp sting of Mrs. Adebio's punishments had begun to dull into a dull ache that Kofi carried with her everywhere she went. School felt like a cage, a place where she was constantly scrutinized for things beyond her control. She wasn't sure how much longer she could go on like this. Imani had noticed the change in her daughter. Kofi's usually bright eyes were clouded with a weariness that Imani hadn't seen before. She'd spent days in the living room, pretending to read her books while secretly watching Kofi, studying the girl she'd known to be full of energy and ambition. But now, Kofi seemed lost, her spirit dimmed by something neither of them could put a name to. It was on one of those quiet afternoons, with the sun casting long shadows across their humble living room, that the first crack in their world began to show. Kofi sat at the table, eyes focused on her schoolwork but her mind 1,000 miles away. Her hands, usually steady, trembled slightly as she scribbled numbers in her notebook. Imani watched her daughter for a long while, her mind swirling with unanswered questions. Why was Kofi so distant? Why did she always come home with bruises both on her body and her spirit? The mother's heart twisted with worry, but her pride held her back. She had always believed in tough love, had always kept her own emotions buried deep beneath layers of control. But that was before she saw the hurt in Kofi's eyes. Why don't you tell me what's going on, Kofi? Imani's voice was gentle but firm, breaking the silence that had settled over them. Kofi glanced up briefly, her face a mask of indifference, but there was something in her eyes, something that made Imani's heart skip a beat. I told you, Mommy, it's nothing, Kofi said, her voice low. She quickly turned her gaze back to the notebook in front of her, her fingers gripping the pen too tightly, as if by doing so she could erase the hurt. Imani felt a pang of frustration. How could Kofi be so stubborn? How could she hold everything inside and not ask for help? Imani had always tried to shield her daughter from the harshness of life, but maybe in doing so, she had made Kofi feel alone. Imani stood up, crossing the room in 2 strides. You don't have to keep it all inside, Kofi. I'm your mother, you can trust me. Kofi hesitated, her eyes flicking nervously to the door as though she might run away if the conversation grew too heavy. She opened her mouth, but the words stuck in her throat. Imani knelt down beside her, her voice softening further. Please, Kofi, I know you're hurting, I can see it, and I don't want you to suffer alone anymore. Kofi's shoulders trembled with the weight of unspoken words. She opened her mouth again, but still the words didn't come. Instead, she buried her face in her hands, and for the first time in a long while, the tears flowed freely. Imani's heart ached. She placed a hand gently on her daughter's shoulder, offering what little comfort she could. But even as she did, she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that there was more at play than Kofi was letting on. There was something in the air, something that had been growing for a while now. It was as if the universe had tilted slightly off course, leaving an opening for something darker to seep in. "What happened at school today?" Imani asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Kofi wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and for the first time in weeks met her mother's gaze. "Mrs. Adebio, Kofi's voice faltered, and for a moment, Imani feared she might close off again. "She hit me. She punished me again, Mommy, for no reason at all." Imani's expression remained neutral, but her mind began to race. She had heard whispers in the village about Mrs. Adebio's heavy-handedness. Some said she was cruel, that her temper was unpredictable, but no one had ever spoken out about it. Imani had never paid much attention to the rumors. After all, Kofi had always been a quiet, obedient child. The idea that Kofi was being mistreated was unfathomable. But the more Kofi spoke, the clearer it became that there was something off about Mrs. Adebio, something that made Imani uneasy, though she couldn't quite place it. She had always trusted the educators in the village, but now her gut was telling her something different. "I'm sorry, Kofi," Imani said quietly, her voice filled with a sudden, uncharacteristic softness. "I should have known." Kofi looked at her mother, her brows furrowed in confusion. Should have known what? Imani stood up, packing in the small room as she tried to make sense of the growing turmoil in her heart. Her eyes flitted to the small window that looked out into the yard, and a sense of foreboding washed over her. There was something wrong, something ancient stirring beneath the surface. Imani had long known there was magic in the world, magic that couldn't always be explained by reason or science. But now, she wondered if that magic was coming to life in ways that she had never expected. "Kofi, there's something I need to tell you," Imani said slowly, her voice steady despite the storm brewing within her. Kofi blinked, unsure of what her mother meant. "Something I should have told you long ago." Kofi looked up, her eyes wide with curiosity. "What is it, Mommy?" Imani took a deep breath. "I'm not just your mother, I have a gift, Kofi, a power that has been passed down through the generations of our family, and now it's beginning to stir again." Kofi's mind whirled with confusion. "A gift, what do you mean, Mommy?" Imani's gaze grew distant as she spoke. "Our family's history is older than you realize, Kofi. There's more to our bloodline than what you've been told. We are the keepers of an ancient magic and it's calling to us. I didn't want you to know, not yet, but it seems you're already being pulled into it, whether you're ready or not." Kofi stared at her mother, her heart pounding in her chest. Magic? Ancient powers? This was like something out of the stories her grandmother used to tell her, stories of gods and spirits, of unseen forces that shaped the world. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" Kofi asked, her voice tinged with disbelief. "Why now?" Imani's eyes darkened. "Because it's dangerous, Kofi. The power we carry is not something to be taken lightly. It can hurt people, it can destroy them. And I've spent my life keeping it buried, keeping it hidden from the world. But now it's coming for us." Kofi felt her knees go weak. The world around her seemed to tilt, as if the ground she stood on was shifting beneath her. Was this why she had been feeling so off balance lately? Was this the reason she'd been drawn into the schoolyard struggles, the weight of her teacher's cruelty, the fear that gripped her every time she stepped into the classroom? "Mommy," Kofi said quietly, "what do we do?" Imani paused, her face softening for a moment. "We have to prepare, Kofi. You'll need to learn how to control it, how to wield it. But more importantly, we need to uncover the truth of why this power has come back. Something has stirred it, and I fear that what is coming is far worse than anything we could ever imagine." Imani's words hung in the air like a heavy fog, and Kofi felt the weight of them settle over her. A deep, unsettling sense of dread filled her, but she couldn't look away. Something had been awakened, and the threads of her life were about to unravel in ways she couldn't even fathom. Outside, the winds began to howl, a storm on the horizon. And somewhere deep in the shadows, a pair of eyes watched them, eyes that had been waiting for this moment. The following morning, the air felt thicker, heavier, as though the world itself was holding its breath. Kofi had barely slept the night before, her mind racing with everything her mother had revealed. Magic, ancient power. The weight of the words pressed down on her chest, a constant reminder of the unknown path ahead. She sat in the small, dimly lit kitchen staring at the half-empty bowl of porridge in front of her. Her hands rested on the table, fingers curled into tight fists as her thoughts spiraled. She couldn't understand it. How could she? Magic wasn't real. It couldn't be. But then her mother's words echoed in her mind over and over again. We are the keepers of an ancient magic. Was it possible? Was it possible that she had inherited something from her ancestors that she had never known about? And if so, what did that mean for her family? Imani had told her that this power could destroy people, that it could harm those around them if not controlled. But how could anyone control something they didn't understand? Kofi's fingers tightened around the edge of the bowl, the porcelain creaking under the pressure. The sound of footsteps broke her reverie. Kofi looked up to find her mother standing in the doorway, her eyes heavy with concern, though her expression remained composed. Kofi, I know this is overwhelming, Imani said softly, her voice soothing yet filled with an unspoken urgency. But you need to listen to me. The power within you, it's not just some gift. It's a responsibility, one that we must take seriously. Kofi didn't respond immediately. She simply nodded, her gaze drifting down to her hands. Her mother was right, of course. This wasn't something that could be ignored, no matter how much Kofi wanted to bury her head in the sand and pretend that nothing had changed. But how could she embrace something so powerful? How could she wield something she didn't even understand? I'm scared, Mommy, Kofi finally admitted, her voice small, almost trembling. What if I can't control it? Imani's expression softened and she crossed the room to sit next to her daughter. Her hand reached out to gently squeeze Kofi's, the warmth of her touch offering a small comfort. Every generation of our family has carried this burden, Kofi. We've all been scared, but we've always found a way to make it through. And you will too, but you need to trust me, you need to trust yourself. Kofi looked into her mother's eyes, searching for reassurance. There was no hint of doubt in her gaze, no hesitation. Imani spoke with a conviction that Kofi longed to mirror, but how could she? She didn't even know where to begin. What should I do? Kofi asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Imani exhaled slowly as though contemplating her next words carefully. We need to learn to unlock it, to understand it. And that means you'll have to practice. I'll teach you step by step, but you must promise me something. Kofi looked up at her mother, her brow furrowing in confusion. What? You must promise me that you won't use this power recklessly. It's tempting, I know, the pull of it is strong, but it can destroy you if you're not careful. Kofi nodded, her heart heavy with the weight of her promise. She had never felt such a sense of responsibility in her life, a power within her that could either protect or harm. Could she really handle something like that? Before she could say anything else, a loud knock sounded at the door. Kofi's heart skipped a beat. It was too early for visitors. Her mother's eyes flicked toward the door, a slight frown pulling at her lips. I'll see who it is, Imani said, her voice low and careful. Stay here. Kofi watched her mother leave the room, her footsteps light but purposeful. Something about the way Imani had reacted to the knock made Kofi uneasy. Her curiosity gnawed at her, but she stayed put, forcing herself to focus on the swirling thoughts in her mind. But it was impossible to concentrate. She couldn't stop thinking about the power that lived inside of her. Was it really magic? Was it something she could learn to control? Or was it something darker, something that would eventually consume her, just as her mother had warned? She stared at the window, watching the light shift as the hours passed. The sounds of the village drifted in from outside, the chatter of neighbors and the hum of distant voices. It was the kind of peaceful morning that made it hard to believe anything was wrong, that anything had changed at all. But Kofi knew better now. She could feel it. The change was in the air, in the very ground beneath her feet. It was only a matter of time before everything would come to a head and there would be no turning back. Imani returned after what seemed like an eternity, her face set in an expression Kofi had never seen before. It was stern, and yet there was something in her eyes that spoke of concern. Her mouth was tight, as though she had just received some news she wasn't prepared for. Kofi, she said, her voice steady but laced with an unmistakable tension. We have to leave now. Kofi's heart jolted at the urgency in her mother's voice. Leave, what do you mean, mommy? Imani didn't waste any time. She moved quickly, gathering a few belongings, pulling a small satchel from the cupboard and stuffing it with essentials. There's no time to explain, Kofi, we're in danger, they're coming for us. Who? Kofi asked, panic rising in her chest. Imani stopped what she was doing and turned to face her daughter. Her expression was filled with a quiet intensity, her gaze locking with Kofi, as if to make sure the gravity of the situation was understood. The people who are after your power, they've been watching us for a long time, Kofi, watching you. The words hit Kofi like a bolt of lightning. She took a step back, her pulse quickening. But we didn't even know about the power until yesterday. How could they have known? Imani's face darkened. Because there are forces out there that have been watching for generations, and now they've found us, we have to go now. Before Kofi could say anything else, her mother grabbed her by the arm, pulling her toward the door. The sudden urgency left Kofi no time to ask more questions, no time to make sense of the whirlwind of emotions swirling inside of her. They left the house quickly, stepping out into the warm sunlight. The village, so familiar just hours ago, now seemed like a different place entirely. As they walked briskly through the narrow streets, Kofi couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed, that eyes were on them even now. But she saw no one, just the usual faces going about their business. Imani's grip on her arm tightened as they reached the edge of the village. We'll be safe for now, she murmured, but we have to move quickly. The wind began to pick up, rustling the trees overhead. Kofi couldn't help but glance over her shoulder, her heart still pounding. There was something out there, she could feel it, but she didn't know what it was or why it was hunting them. All she knew was that her life had changed forever. The walk to the outskirts of the village felt endless. Each step was heavier than the last, the weight of her mother's words pressing down on Kofi's shoulders. They're after you, Kofi. They've always been watching. Her thoughts were a blur, swirling around the revelation like a storm that couldn't be calmed. Who were they, and why now? What did they want from her family? They hadn't spoken since leaving the house, and the silence between them felt like an unspoken understanding that Kofi wasn't sure she was ready for. Her mother's pace was brisk, determined, yet there was an edge to her movements that Kofi had never seen before. Her usual calm, collected demeanor was gone. In its place, there was a fire, an urgency, a need to get away, to run from something or perhaps from someone. Mommy, Kofi began, her voice barely above a whisper, as though the words themselves were too heavy to say aloud. Imani glanced over at her, her eyes softening but still filled with that same quiet intensity. We don't have time to talk right now, Kofi. We need to get to the old temple. It's the only place that might be safe for us. The old temple? Kofi had heard stories of it as a child, the place where the elders gathered to perform sacred rituals to honor the ancestors, a place of great power. But she had never been there. It was forbidden for those not chosen, and only the most revered in the village ever set foot inside. Why was her mother taking her there now? Why the temple? Kofi asked, her voice betraying the unease gnawing at her gut. Imani's expression was unreadable, but her eyes flashed with a brief flicker of something Kofi couldn't quite place. Because the temple holds secrets, Kofi, secrets that could protect us. Kofi's heart quickened. What kind of secrets? Her mother's lips pressed together in a tight line, and for a moment, Kofi thought she might not answer. But then Imani spoke, her voice low and steady. It's where the first of our family's power was sealed away, the power you now carry. Kofi stopped walking, her heart pounding in her chest. Sealed away, she echoed, struggling to grasp what her mother was saying. But you said this power is a part of us, that it's something we must learn to wield. Why would it be sealed away? Imani paused, her gaze flickering to the horizon as if she were weighing the gravity of Kofi's question. The silence that stretched between them was thick with unspoken history. It was sealed away to protect us, to keep us safe from those who would use it for evil. Who would use it for evil? Kofi asked, her voice trembling despite herself. Her mother's eyes met hers, and Kofi saw the truth in them, a truth that had been hidden for so long. The people who have been watching us, the ones who are after you. Kofi's mind raced. It was all starting to feel like a nightmare, one that she couldn't wake up from. Her mother had said nothing about these so-called enemies before now, and yet it seemed they had been lurking in the shadows, waiting for the moment to strike. "Who are they, Mommy?" Kofi's voice cracked as the question left her lips. Imani's jaw tightened. "They're called the Ancients, a group that has existed for centuries seeking to control the power of our family line. They believe that the magic we carry is the key to unlocking untold power that could rule the world." Kofi's breath hitched. "They want to control us." "They want to control the power within you," her mother corrected, her tone sharp. "And if they get their hands on you, Kofi, everything we've fought for, everything we've protected will be lost. The balance will tip and nothing will stop them." Kofi swallowed hard, her heart hammering in her chest. This was bigger than she had imagined, far bigger than she could have ever prepared for. The Ancients. They weren't just after her family, they were after the very source of their existence, the essence of everything that had kept them safe, and they would stop at nothing to get it. "I don't understand," Kofi whispered, more to herself than to her mother. "How could I have this power inside me and not even know it? Why now? Why me?" Imani stopped walking and turned to face her daughter, her expression softening. "It was always inside of you, Kofi. The magic is passed down through the bloodline, and as you've grown, it has begun to awaken. The Ancients must have sensed it. They always do." Kofi shook her head, struggling to make sense of it all. "But I don't know how to control it. I don't even know what it is." Imani's hand reached out to gently rest on Kofi's shoulder, grounding her. "That's why we're going to the temple, to unlock it, to learn what it truly means to wield this power. You are not alone in this, Kofi. I will teach you." Kofi nodded, her chest tight with a mix of fear and determination. She had no choice but to trust her mother. For the first time, she felt the weight of her ancestry, of the legacy she was born into, and the burden that came with it. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about protecting everything they held dear. The two of them walked in silence for a while, the journey taking them deeper into the wilderness surrounding the village. The path grew more treacherous as they moved further from the familiar streets of their home, the dense forest closing in around them. The air grew cooler, and the sounds of the village faded into the distance, replaced by the rustling of leaves and the occasional call of birds. Kofi felt the familiar tug of her instincts, the feeling of something pulling at her from the shadows. She couldn't shake the sense that they were being watched, that eyes were upon them, hidden in the trees, in the very air itself. She glanced over at her mother, but Imani's expression remained calm, unperturbed. "Do you feel it?" Kofi asked, her voice low, barely above a whisper. Imani nodded, her eyes scanning the trees ahead of them. "I do, they are close, we must hurry." Kofi's heart raced as they quickened their pace, each step a beat closer to the unknown. The temple was just ahead, or so her mother had said, but Kofi couldn't help but wonder if they were walking straight into a trap. As they neared a clearing, Kofi's senses heightened. The air seemed to thrum with an unfamiliar energy, as though the very ground beneath her feet was alive with some ancient power. Her breath caught in her throat as they stepped into the clearing, and there, in the center, stood the temple. It was more magnificent than she had ever imagined. The stone structure was ancient, weathered by centuries of time, its walls covered in intricate carvings that seemed to tell a story of their own, stories of power, of battles fought, of secrets kept. It was both beautiful and intimidating, a reminder of what was at stake. Her mother took a step forward, her hand brushing against the stone as she muttered something under her breath. The air grew heavier, charged with a power Kofi could feel deep in her bones. "Come, Kofi," Imani said, her voice urgent. "This is where your journey truly begins." With one last glance at the temple, Kofi stepped forward, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know what awaited her inside, but she knew one thing for certain: nothing would ever be the same again. The stone temple was darker inside than Kofi had imagined. The air was thick with an energy that seemed to pulse through the walls, its ancient magic whispering in a language she couldn't understand. The moment her foot crossed the threshold, she felt the weight of history pressing down on her, felt the echoes of countless generations who had stood here before her. Imani led the way, her pace unwavering as she moved toward the heart of the temple. The faint flicker of torchlight illuminated their path, casting long shadows on the carved walls that seemed to come alive under the dim light. Symbols, faces, and figures danced across the stone, telling stories of gods and spirits, ancestors and warriors. Kofi's breath caught as they passed an enormous mural on the left depicting a woman standing tall, her arms raised to the sky as lightning crackled around her. The woman's eyes seemed to follow Kofi, and she couldn't shake the feeling that it was more than just a painting. It was a warning. "Do you see her, Kofi?" Imani asked, her voice steady as she glanced at the mural. Kofi nodded slowly, unsure of what to say. "Who is she?" Imani's gaze softened, but there was an unmistakable sadness in her eyes. "That is your ancestor, Nia, the first of our line to wield the power you now carry. She was a great warrior, but also the last to fully unlock the magic. The ancients were after her, too." Kofi felt a chill run down her spine. The history of her family was far darker and more complex than she had ever realized. Her mother had only ever shared fragments, stories half told, but now in this sacred place the truth was unraveling before her eyes. "I'm scared, Mommy," Kofi admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Imani stopped and turned to face her daughter, her expression fierce yet comforting. "I know you are, Kofi, but you were born for this. You were born to stop them, to protect the balance." Kofi swallowed hard, feeling the weight of her mother's words settle deep within her. She had always known that there was something different about her, something powerful, but she had never imagined it would come to this. She had always thought her magic was just a part of her heritage, a part of who she was. But now she understood that it was more than just a gift. It was a responsibility, a curse perhaps. They continued deeper into the temple, and the air seemed to grow colder the further they went. The walls narrowed, and the sound of their footsteps echoed louder in the oppressive silence. Kofi could feel her heart racing, the uncertainty building inside her. What awaited them at the center of this place? At last they arrived in a grand chamber, its high ceilings supported by massive stone pillars. In the center of the room was an altar, its surface adorned with symbols Kofi recognized from the murals, symbols of power, of life and death. The altar was the heart of the temple, and it was here that the family's power had been sealed away. Imani stepped forward, her hand outstretched, and Kofi followed her instinctively, feeling a magnetic pull toward the altar. As they reached it, Imani turned to face her daughter, her eyes filled with a deep, knowing sorrow. "Kofi," she said softly, her voice trembling just slightly, "the power inside you has been waiting to awaken. You must face it now. You must choose whether to embrace it or let it consume you." Kofi's throat tightened as she gazed at her mother, the weight of her words pressing down on her. She wanted to run. She wanted to turn away from it all and pretend it wasn't real. But deep down, she knew that she couldn't. Not anymore. "What do I have to do?" Kofi asked, her voice shaky but resolute. Imani took a deep breath, her gaze never leaving Kofi's. "You must perform the ritual, the one that will unlock your full potential. You must call upon the power, awaken it, and claim it as your own. But be warned, Kofi, once you begin, there is no turning back. The ancients will know, and they will come for you." Kofi felt a lump form in her throat, but she nodded. There was no other choice. Not for her, not for her family, and certainly not for the village. Imani stepped back, giving her space, and Kofi knelt before the altar. Her palms pressed against the cool stone, and she closed her eyes, focusing all her energy on the task at hand. The air hummed with power, and she felt it inside her, that strange force that had always been a part of her. It was like a fire, a storm waiting to be unleashed. With a deep breath, Kofi spoke the words her mother had taught her, the ancient incantation passed down through their bloodline. She spoke the words in a language that felt both foreign and familiar, as though they had always been inside her, waiting to be spoken. The moment the words left her lips, the ground beneath her trembled. A low rumble filled the air, and Kofi's body surged with energy. She could feel the magic coursing through her veins, flooding her senses with an intensity she couldn't comprehend. The power was unlike anything she had ever known, alive, vibrant, dangerous. Suddenly, the room erupted in light, blinding and overwhelming. Kofi's heart pounded in her chest as the magic surged outward, spiraling around her in a vortex of raw energy. She felt as though she were being torn apart, pulled in every direction at once. The walls of the temple seemed to pulse with the same energy, as though the very building were alive with the magic she had unleashed. Kofi cried out, but her voice was lost in the roar of the magic. She felt as though she were floating, suspended between worlds. Time seemed to stretch, and for a moment she thought she might lose herself entirely. But then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the light faded, and Kofi found herself on her knees, gasping for breath. The room was silent now, and the air felt different, charged, heavier. Kofi opened her eyes, and she could feel the power inside her vibrating in her chest. It was no longer a foreign force. It was her own. She had claimed it. But as she looked up at her mother, she saw the fear in Amani's eyes, the unease that had settled there. "Mom," Kofi asked, her voice barely a whisper. Amani shook her head, her expression darkening. "It's not over, Kofi. The ancients, they've felt your awakening." Kofi's heart skipped a beat. The ancients, the ones who had been hunting her, they were coming, and now she had no choice but to face them. The temple door slammed open, and Kofi's body tensed, her heart racing. Figures stepped into the chamber, their faces hidden beneath dark hoods, their eyes glowing with a malevolent light. The ancients had arrived. "You've awakened the power, child," one of them spoke, their voice like ice. "But now you will learn the cost." Imani stood beside Kofi, her hand resting on her daughter's shoulder. "We will never let you take her," Imani declared, her voice firm. The ancients laughed, the sound hollow and cold. "You have no choice in the matter, old woman, she is ours." The battle had only just begun.